So, welcome to another consideration of George Herbert's poetry. Today, one of his most famous poems, called the Pulley. This is one of his most anthologized poems, and in some ways most characteristic of the type of poetry described as metaphysical. It's quite a short poem, but distinctive in Herbert's output for the way it articulates God's voice as the central figure in the drama. It's also unlike a number of other of Herbert's poems in that it's so self-consciously witty, punning on the word rest throughout for a significant part of its effect. This is a poem which seeks to make sense of why the world is the way it is. What Milton would later describe as justifying the ways of God to men. The poem asks the question, why is mankind imperfect? And it comes to the conclusion that this imperfection was a deliberate choice on God's part. The title of the poem is worth considering before we read the poem itself. A pulley, as the picture demonstrates, is a means of lifting a heavy weight, and it seems strange that there's no mention of a pulley at all in the poem. However, as this diagram shows, the weight is raised by the means of drawing something downwards, and this type of paradox was one which interested Herbert greatly. At the end of Easter Wings, for example, he describes how the fall may further the flight in me, the image there conveying the idea that, having fallen further, the effect of God's grace is more markedly felt because it raises the sinner that much higher on the way to heaven. Let's read the poem. When God first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, "Let us," said he, "pour on him all we can, let the world's riches which dispersed lie contract into a span." So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honour, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay, perceiving that, alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. "For if I should," said he, "bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast." We'll begin by looking at some of the difficult vocabulary in the poem, and I think it's striking how little there is. In many ways, it's a very straightforward poem, even for modern readers. The world's riches being dispersed simply means that they're scattered. They're not all in one place. To contract them into a span means to bring them together into one short, small space. A span can mean the distance from one's thumb to the tip of one's little finger, a hand span, the span of one's arm. Is also used to describe a human life, one's lifespan, and traditionally in the Bible the term of one's life is 70 years and 10, 70 years. So it's a short space of time and a small space, that of the human body. The next tricky item of vocabulary comes in stanza 3. To bestow something is not only to give a gift, but it is to confer or place some sort of an honour on the recipient. A title might be bestowed upon the lucky recipient of a knighthood. A creature in this sense doesn't mean an animal or a monster, but it is quite literally something which you have created, a creation. The last difficult word in this poem is repining in stanza 4. It means to fret or feel anxiety. Let's talk a little bit about the logic and narrative of the poem. It's quite straightforward. It begins with an image of God making man. God like a sort of craftsman in his workshop, and he has a glass or a vase or a jug of some sort containing blessings at his hand. And he says, I will give man all of these blessings. Then in stanza 2, Herbert lists the blessings which God has given man: beauty, wisdom, honour, pleasure. God then pauses, he made a stay, realising that the last thing left at the bottom of this jug is rest. There's a nice pun there. The rest is left in the bottom of the glass. And the fact that rest is at the bottom, I think, is another nice little visual pun by Herbert, because rest is associated with heaviness, with sleep, with lying down, and so it's wholly appropriate that rest should be at the bottom of the glass. God then reflects on whether he should give man this final gift of rest. He realizes that if man possessed rest, the ability to find peace within himself, then he would have no need of God. He would adore his gifts instead of me. The fourth line of this stanza conveys an idea of rest not only in the sense of finding peace and tranquility, but I think also in the sense of rest as in death, rest in peace, as we're familiar from seeing on tombstones. And God thinks man should not wish simply to rest in nature, to live out his existence only in the physical, bodily world, but know that man also needs the spiritual existence that can only be found in God. Therefore, in stanza 5, God makes the decision to withhold rest from man. And though he gives man gifts of talent, of the ability to create beautiful art, of the ability to behave honourably and to feel pleasurable physical sensations, that should always be accompanied by a sensation of anxiety, of fretfulness. In the third line of this stanza, God decides that man should be rich and weary, that to be rich and to have achieved great physical and monetary success, to possess all sorts of things, a beautiful body, a fine house, should not be a source of inner peace. And God justifies this final decision on the grounds that he knows that very few humans will ever achieve the level of spiritual perfection needed to reach God on their own. Arguably none ever will. And he understands that mankind will always be striving after other things than God, after human relationships, after wealth, after power. And God therefore takes a very pragmatic decision. That is, if man can only find rest in God, then that will be enough to bring him back to God and to the salvation that only God can provide. This poem is interesting for its use of voices. In a poem such as Love 3, we have seen Herbert dramatising a dialogue between man and God. But in this poem, there is a narrator and there is God, which is perhaps unlike any of the other poems in the collection. It's also striking for how measured and calm the emotional quality of the voice is. This is not a poem of a dramatic outpouring of grief or of spiritual anguish, but rather a calmly, quietly reflective poem. To me, this seems to be Herbert adopting a persona that's quite different from many of his other poems. In a poem such as Easter Wings, for example, he reflects on his own spiritual experience and how he became most thin through sickness. In The Collar, he dramatises a voice that is racked with emotional torment and frustration at his state of being. But in this poem, it seems to me that Herbert adopts the mask of a teacher, Yet I don't think it's a teacher that would find himself in an academic ivory tower such as Trinity College, Cambridge. Rather, I think this is a preacher speaking to people with very ordinary, everyday experiences, such as his congregation in Bemerton, near Salisbury. The deliberate simplicity of the imagery, the choice of the title of a pulley, a piece of equipment such as would have been found on any farm or any workshop in agricultural England at the time, I think is deliberate. Herbert is explaining the apparently contradictory actions of God to an audience and bringing it into the realm of their understanding. The poem is simple, it is very direct, yet the way the poem explores this word rest finds a complexity building up as Herbert reveals to us as readers the many layers of meaning which the word possesses. Herbert was a poet who had a treasure house of certain words, such as sweet, for example, or dust, which contained for him essential meanings and layers of meanings in which he could express highly complex ideas in a single word. And in this poem, rest does that job for him. As I commented on an earlier slide, rest in the bottom of the vase or the bottom of the jug in stanza 2 is an image of something being left over, just as it's also a great gift. There's a contradiction there. The rest, the leftovers, the unwanted things are the jewel which God could bestow on his creation. And yet, I think this poem in some ways echoed Redemption, where Herbert reminds his reader that God is to be found not in palaces and great resorts, in cities, theatres, gardens, parks and courts, but rather amidst a ragged noise and mirth of thieves and murderers. God is to be found in the rest, and the greatest gifts we can receive in life are not necessarily those of honour, wisdom and pleasure, but rather of peace. In the context of Herbert's own biography, it's interesting that rest should be that thing which he most desires. Wisdom he certainly had, he studied at Cambridge. Honour, again he came from a distinguished family. His older brother was a senior aristocrat. His mother had filled their house when he was young with the leading thinkers, writers, intellectuals of the day. Pleasure too, he had access to fine music at Salisbury Cathedral. And yet what he most potently desires is rest. And hence this word gathers different meanings. By the fourth stanza of the poem, rest has come to mean that which is left over, those other things, in other words, the gifts he did give to man, wisdom, honour, pleasure. But restlessness ends that second line as that state of being which will characterise man's existence. There's something wonderful about those three syllables, restlessness. There's too many S's. It's orally extremely successful in having almost three strong syllables together, restlessness. I think it's an extremely clever little piece of writing to end the poem, which has otherwise been extremely conversational in its diction, with a little auditory stumbling block for the reader. And it's in the last line that Herbert concludes his poem with one of the most surprising choices of verbs in any of his poetry. If goodness lead him not, well, the word lead there recalls the image of Jesus as a shepherd, leading his flock through the dangers of life into the safety of eternal life with God. Yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Toss seems almost offhand, and yet I think it also evokes images of being tossed on the ocean in a storm. Weariness may toss him to my breast. there's something in it, perhaps also of, in that image of a rocking ship, of not the rest which a baby finds being rocked to sleep in the arms of its mother, but of adults as they are tossed by the passions and storms of life. And so we come to the end of our consideration of this lovely little George Herbert poem. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy your study of Herbert.